Hi students, here we are. I got a different angle today and I want to continue on with notes on period 4. I'll try to make this as short as I can. I don't necessarily want to break it up into two videos, so I'll go through quite a bit of information, but I'll make it as quick as I can. You've already seen that, and we talked about this in class. For you who are in class, we're going to come back to this for Friday's class who didn't quite get through this. What I want to get into, and I want you to remember overall that everything that we're talking about in period 4 is what we call antebellum, before the Civil War. And so everything that we talk about is really building itself toward the Civil War. We're going to get into, the Civil War into period 5. And so a lot of this is the tension that kind of builds in one way or another, whether it's social, economic, or political tension. So regional interests often trumped national concerns as the basis for many political leaders' positions on slavery and economic policy. So John Calhoun, we've already heard about John Calhoun some. We're going to hear about him again. Remember, he had run for president he had been vice president under John Quincy Adams and Andrew Jackson. And John Calhoun is in politics for a very long time, and he brings up what's called the positive good argument, which is really kind of very ironic. Now, John Calhoun, I should tell you, if you heard from class before, is a Southerner. He's from South Carolina. Well, he argues that slavery is a positive good. Slavery is actually a good thing for Black Americans who are enslaved. In fact, it's such a good thing because it gives them a job, it gives them clothes and food, and it really provides a lot for both slaves and free, for white people and for Black people, which is really a skewed idea because it should make you think, well, then if it was so great, why was there still why were there still runaway slaves happening? Why were people still continuing to rebel and riot? Why were there work slowdowns and sabotage? If slavery was such a great thing, then why are all these things happening? But John Calhoun tried to, really his entire life, tried to convince people, and I think he truly, deep down, felt that it was a positive good, that he was doing what was best for those who were enslaved under him. Eventually, when we talk about these regional interests, we're going to get into the Compromise of 1820, the Missouri Compromise. Now, if you remember the Northwest Ordinance of 1785 and 1787, if you look at that map, remember those 5 states were added into the United States. After we get the the Louisiana Territory added, we have to figure out how are all of these areas going to be incorporated. Well, you remember you had to have 60,000 people in order to become a state. And so Henry Clay actually is the one who kind of came up with the Missouri Compromise. And he said, okay, here's the deal. Everything above the 3630, if you look at that, the 36-degree latitude, everything above the 3630 line is going to be free state. And everything below that is going to be slave state. So this is all between pro-slavery and anti-slavery. However, the question of Missouri is coming up. Now, this is really important because in the Missouri Compromise, both Missouri and Maine were applying for statehood at that time. And Missouri, then they decided in the Missouri Compromise of 1820, Missouri would become a slave state and Maine would become a free state. Now, this is really important when we talk about a landmark case in 1857, I want to say, because Missouri is a slave state and Illinois is a free state. So keep that in mind as we get later on into our discussions of slavery and court cases. So a lot of this had to do with the sectional balance in the Senate. Slave states in the South, they didn't want to have too much they didn't want to have not enough representation in the Senate. They wanted to have a good sectional balance. You only get 2 votes in the Senate. Well, they wanted to say, well, if this one is, and we should get because otherwise you could start making some laws. Because here was the situation. Do you remember the Fugitive Slave Act? We had talked about the Fugitive Slave Clause of 1793, that it said a couple things. One, the Fugitive Slave Clause said that if escaped slaves went into a free state, they had to be legally returned to their owners or back to the slave state. It also said that the slave trade would continue for another 20 years. Well, a lot of people were pushing for that fugitive slave clause or act to end, to say this is completely unconstitutional. It needs to end. If slaves are in a free state, they should get to be free. They don't have to be forced to go back. And northern states, white people shouldn't have to force them to go back if they're in a northern state. So at the same time, it's not just about pro-slavery and anti-slavery, it's also about land. You know, the economics of what is going on in the South, now we are seeing cotton become really, really important. And Andrew Jackson introduces something called the Indian Removal Act of 1830. Now remember, in like the War of 1812, Andrew Jackson is the hero. Like Andrew Jackson, I mean, stupidly, he shouldn't have been the hero of the Battle of New Orleans, but he was. But like Andrew Jackson is really kind of this interesting figure. Well, he's able to pass through, when he becomes president, he's able to pass through in Congress the Indian Removal Act. And what it had to do was with Cherokee, Cree, Choctaw, Seminole, many of these large Native American groups in the South there. So even in areas that were not part of the original 13 states, we're talking like Alabama, Tennessee, Florida, lots of Seminole tribes in Florida, North Carolina, South Carolina had a lot of Cree and Choctaw and Cherokee. So here's what basically Andrew Jackson said. Okay, we want this land. The American government wants your land, Native Americans, because they kind of had like, Native Americans kind of had like this sovereignty, like they could do their own thing on this land, but they were part of the American, like they were on the government's like land, but they could make their own rules. They were like sovereign. Well, Andrew Jackson kind of got them to strike a deal, many of them, especially the Cherokee. And he said, if you give up your land, and we're talking pretty much entire states worth, like huge millions and millions of acres worth, you give up your land here, and we'll give you, we, the American government, Andrew Jackson, will give you free land in this area west of the Mississippi. And so the Indian Removal Act, sometimes it was forceful and sometimes it was not, allowed this kind of flip-flop of Indians to be settled west of the Mississippi, of Native American groups. If you've ever heard of the Trail of Tears, the Trail of Tears went on for a very, very long time. This was part of that Removal Act, where people died from exhaustion and disease and malnutrition and starvation, literally walking from like South Carolina, North Carolina, Georgia, Florida, Alabama, all the way to pretty much what we know today as Oklahoma. The South Carolina nullification of tariffs, this again has to do with sectional differences. Here we go, John Calhoun. He makes this protest against a tariff that was imposed, and he said, we're not gonna pay it. Like, we're not gonna pay this tariff. I don't care that the national government said it, we have to, we're not going to pay the tariff. Well, this is a huge deal because it basically says, well, federal government, you can do whatever you want, but if we're not gonna abide by it, what are you gonna do? And so this nullification of a federal law by South Carolina is a big, big deal. Jackson actually is going to force South Carolina, John Calhoun, and South Carolina to abide by, to pay the tariff. And they don't have to get that far. Jackson was going to bring in the military to make South Carolina pay for their tariff, especially on cotton, other products as well. But we don't get that far. Actually, we come up with a compromise. Henry Clay is surprisingly one who kind of helps with it. And the compromise is South Carolina, you're gonna take away the nullification. You are going to abide by the tariff, by the federal rule, but we're gonna lower the tariff. So Jackson gave a little bit and Calhoun gave a little bit, and they came to an agreement. And it didn't require the military to step in and take force and take action under Jackson's direction. So one crisis is avoided, but you can already see the writing on the wall. This problem between the federal government and the state governments and who wants what, a lot relating to economics, especially in the South, because there's a lot of people getting rich off of Black enslaved people in the South. Okay, completely shifting directions, although when you start to think of it, maybe not as much as maybe you would quite think. While Americans embraced a new national culture, various groups developed distinctive cultures of their own. The rise of democratic and individualistic beliefs, a response to rationalism and changes to society caused by the market revolution, I'll talk about that, along with greater social and geographical mobility, contributed to a second Great Awakening among Protestants that influenced moral and social reforms and inspired utopian and other religious movements. So let me just real briefly talk about the market revolution. You're going to hear about it more specifically, but the market revolution started to say, we're going to change kind of our economic structure, our market economy, from less like regional and local to more national, more broad. So let me put it to you this way. Let's say you make saddles. You make saddles, like for horses, right? You make saddles and you essentially sell to the people who are within, like 20 miles radius of you. Well, now with the market revolution, you're going to send your saddles like many states away. You're going to trade and do business with many different areas, many different regions, not just kind of your local economy. This is going to mean a couple of different things, but really important things. One, you have to have good supply systems. You have to have good transportation. You have to have good kind of economic structure. We'll talk about Henry Clay again because his American system really lets this happen. So the market revolution is quite important as we look at the economic structure. But the social structure gives us this whole other idea. Things like, and we're going to talk very specifically about Seneca Falls when we're in class together, but utopian communities. Remember when you read the book, The Giver? Do you remember that book, The Giver? This idea that we can make this perfect society. Usually it meant they removed themselves. Communities would kind of make their own, form their little own communities of these kind of perfect societies. The next one, number 4, is the one that I really, really need you to hone in on. This idea of nativism. In fact, we'll keep talking about nativism as kind of a theme probably about the next 3 periods. Like nativism keeps coming up and rearing its ugly head. And the idea of nativism is that native-born people who are born in America are superior, are probably more privileged, should, what's the word I use, protected, should be more protected than immigrant people. Well, this is a time of great waves of immigration. I mean, we're going to see these waves, these periods of immigration. If the idea that American-born, and usually we're talking like a couple of generations here, if American-born citizens are more special than immigrant-born citizens, you can see where this dichotomy is going to happen. And it's going to be, again, the us versus them. And typically it's going to rear its ugly head in social structure and economic structure, sometimes political structure as well. We've got the American Temperance Society. We'll look at we'll spy a document on that, on the problems that alcohol was having on families. Prison reform, Dorothea Dix said we cannot treat prisoners like dogs. You can't chain them up, do all these different things. Horace Mann reformed education. There was new national culture that emerged as a combination of American elements, European influences, regional cultural sensibilities. We are starting to really, really expand in not only the political thought and the economic thought, but kind of this whole artistic idea. Whereas before, most of that had come from Europe. Now it's like, hey, we can do this ourselves, and we've got some really, genius thinkers and really creative people. So We see transcendentalists, and the idea of transcendentalism is that you're going beyond. I think in English you're going to read about people like Ralph Waldo Emerson and Henry David Thoreau, where they, Walden in Civil Disobedience is probably one of the most famous of, it is the most famous of Thoreau's, where they were able to kind of go beyond the basic idea that people, the way people behaved, the way people thought, the way they viewed society, politics, religion, everything like that. I'm just going to kind of go through these. Know that these are names who were part of this kind of lasting reform, this new national culture. We're not British anymore. Now we're American. What does it mean to be an American? And these people are kind of showing. If you've ever heard of the Audubon Society, for instance, James Audubon is the one who started that. We've got a new American dictionary, an American dictionary of the English language. We see these things emerging right now. Liberal social ideas from abroad and romantic beliefs in the human perfectibility influence literature, art, philosophy, and architecture. We see this idea of romanticism and transcendentalism, federal style of architecture. There you see, that's a federal style of architecture, that house on the very top. That's a very common style, colonial looking house. Thomas Jefferson's Rotunda. So this is just more of not only the Second Great Awakening in the religious aspect, but this kind of awakening to an American way to look at things. It's not British anymore. Now it's a more liberal, social, American way to look at things. Okay, so this is actually going to be the last thing. I'm not even going to talk about all this. I'm just going to talk about a little bit of it, and then the rest of it we're going to do in class together. Enslaved blacks and free African Americans created communities and strategies to protect their dignity and family structures, and they joined political efforts aimed at changing their status. So we just kind of mentioned about that, like work slowdowns, sabotage, runaways. If slavery was so good, the way Calhoun said, and it was a positive good, then why were these things still happening? There were still spirituals. Remember, one of the ways that slave owners actually hurt the system even worse for enslaved people was to separate families. They knew that that would leave the most damaging effects. Now, sometimes they would actually keep families together because they were worried that men especially would try to escape to be with their family. But oftentimes it didn't matter. If you were a child and you had a dad and a family together, like you were sold, or you went with your mom and your dad went somewhere else, like it was a really tragic way to treat human beings. And they did whatever they could to hold on to anything they found hope in. Any slave that found even a glimmer of hope, if that meant through song, if that meant through chanting, through camaraderie with their friends, they did it. And I want to talk about the American Colonization Society. This is what was created that basically said, we need to be able to send people back to Africa. In fact, Thomas Jefferson very much was a proponent of recolonizing, sending African Americans back to Africa because that's where they belonged. Like, we brought them here for a purpose, and now it's just causing too much trouble, so let's just send them back. The American Colonization Society was really like this active kind of emancipation in the United States, and I do have to say, a lot of people went to Africa to live. Like, they were emancipated in the United States for one reason or another, and they went back to probably maybe where their heritage had come from at one point. And so especially Liberia, it was kind of created as a safe haven and a free area for emancipated black previous enslaved people. Benjamin Lundy, the genius of universal emancipation, this was the idea that it had to happen gradually. Benjamin Lundy said that you couldn't just emancipate and just be like, okay, all slaves, we're ending, all slaves are free. It had to be a gradual emancipation. So I know that was a really quick overview. What I want you to know is that when you come to class, we're going to talk more about the reform movements, especially in Seneca Falls. So until next time, we'll see you then.